Um, Let me see. I always like to break up things a little bit before I start. Would everyone who believes in psychokinesis please raise my hand? I would have saved that till the middle after I got started, but I had to break things up. My talk is on the biofield, life as a hyperdimensional quantity. Basically, I'm a historian of science as well as a scientist. I don't even like to be called a physicist. I have another name for it that I'll give it to you later. But so I do everything sort of historically oriented. And life has always, by many scientists and scholars, has always been considered something extra. And this has a history. There are old ideas dating back to the 16th century, 17th century of a life force, a vital force, an elan vital. This actually drove science for a while. One of the famous instances was Luigi Galvani, who was experimenting in the 1780s, 1790s. He had a frog, a dead pithed frog, laying on a metal table, and he touched the leg with a metal scalpel, and the leg jumped. And he was trying to investigate something called bioelectrogenesis. So he thought he had discovered life. Alessandro Volta came along and said no, and developed a battery from that, basically metal with an electrolyte between it. But Galvani swore that he had discovered the basis of life, and it was electric. Mesmer, who we had a good talk on Mesmer the other day, thought the basis of life was magnetic and developed mesmerism. Later on, it became associated with hypnosis and more ESP and such. As science learned more about electricity and magnetism, these ideas of electricity or magnetism being the basis of life fell by the sideline. So they decline as we get into Faraday and Maxwell discovering electricity. A very good example of this is the Frankenstein monster, Mary Shelley's book in 1818, because basically there's a Newtonian worldview, and they thought life was the parts of the body. The sum of the parts make the whole. So if you put all the parts of the body back together, you'd have a living body, and that was the Frankenstein monster. But what happened? The Frankenstein monster was not alive. It was not the sum of the parts of the body. Had to give it electricity to make it live. And this goes back to this old thing that life is somehow associated with electricity and magnetism. Then there's a resurgence. This sort of died as science became more and more reductive over the years, and we became more Newtonian, which we still are very Newtonian. And there's a resurgence of the field concept of life in the 1970s, where Alexander Dubrov in 1973 was working on something called biogravitation. And he thought that was associated with life. And more, he thought that was associated with ESP and the paranormal. And he was trying to develop a unified field theory, though. And then that was revived in Tobin's book with Sarfati and Wolff in 1979. But still, they weren't looking for the basis of life being a field property. They were looking for more an explanation of paranormal phenomena. And more recently, we have Beverly Rubik, who right now is over next door talking. I'm sorry because she's missing my talk and I'm missing hers. Will Tiller, Pop, Savli Sava, Zhang, Welch. And these people are all in the past 10, 15, 20 years working on the concept of a biofield, that life is basically a field phenomenon, not a quantum phenomenon, but a field phenomenon. And this is a quote from Rubik's paper, The Biofield Hypothesis, her 2002 paper. The biological field is seen as a holistic or global organizing field of the organism by all these authors. And then she goes on later to say, a full scientific model of the human being may indeed require elements that go beyond space-time, matter-energy, and require multi-dimensional geometry or other novel concepts. And that's basically what I'm going to do. I'm going to show you or try and explain how life is, the biofield is a hyperdimensional quantity. The biofield in general, the biofield is a true the biofield is a true physical field, it must be fundamental to the very structure of natural reality, because we've only got four fields: the electromagnetic, the gravitational, strong nuclear fields. They are basic to the structure of reality. So the biofield, if it exists and it is a true field phenomenon, must be fundamental to the structure of reality. The biofield does not especially have a force associated with it, as do gravity, electricity, and magnetism. Although Tiller and other people think it might, I contend that it doesn't have a force associated with it. Life evolved from chemical reactions depending upon the four natural forces which were already in place before life evolved. So if you study the evolution of life, then it couldn't have a force associated with it, but it's somehow structure within the existing physical fields. Life, or the biofield, has the structural qualities of a field, but is passive, not dynamically active, like gravity, electricity, and magnetism. Life is either a structural entity or fundamental construction within the very fabric of physical reality, a construction of already existing fields, and that is the biofield. So then next question is, what is physical reality? Now, I contend our physical reality is hyperdimensional, meaning having more dimensions than 4. There are pure physical theories presently which seek to explain reality as a unification of quantum and relativity theories rather than strictly theories of life or consciousness. These are pure physical theories that at this time have nothing to do with life. They're the pure 5-dimensional theories. The first one was by Clifford in 1869. In 1870, he worked with a 4-dimensional space. 3-dimensional space is curved in a 4th dimension with a separate time. Einstein comes along, unifies time and space in 1905, and then we have a 4-dimensional space-time. Then Kaluza, in 1921, expands general relativity, 4-dimensional space-time, into a 5-dimensional space, unifies the electromagnetic field and the gravitational field. This has never been disproved. It has never been verified, though, because there was no predictive value in Kaluza's theory. 1926, that was developed into the Kaluza-Klein theory. Klein made modifications on Kaluza's theory, limiting it to approximately our extension of the 5th dimension is approximately a Planck length, about 10 to the negative 40th meters. Then in 1938, and for a few years after that, Einstein worked on the Kaluza theory. He, Bergman, and Bargmann worked on an Einstein-Kaluza theory. This is not the Kaluza-Klein theory, because Einstein, Bergman, and Bargmann demonstrated that our extension of the 5th dimension could be macroscopically sized. So this is different from the Kaluza-Klein theory. Kaluza-Klein theory would have to be limited to about a Planck length extension of the 5th dimension. And then recently, I've been developing my theory since about 1980. Robert Barr is working on a 5-dimensional ether theory. There's a group based on the work of Wesson up in Canada who's working on a 5-dimensional theory very similar to the superstring theories. And there are other 5-dimensional theories. Then we also have the holographic universe, or the implicate order of David Bohm. That is not specifically hyperdimensional, but it implies higher dimensions of space with his hidden variable. I consider Bohm's hidden variable to be a 5th dimension. Then there are supergravity theories in the 1980s, which are still hanging around. They're 11-dimensional. And then there's superstring theory starting in the 1980s and then into the 1990s. In the 1990s, they evolved into brane theories or membrane theories. And they are aiming towards the M theory, which would be the final theory, the theory of everything. Those are 10-dimensional, maybe 11-dimensional, because they unify with the supergravity theory. Now, the supergravity and superstring theories are based on the Kaluza-Klein model. I am not working with the Kaluza-Klein model. I'm working with the Einstein-Kaluza model. So mine is a competing theory with the superstring and supergravity theories. Now, there are other hyperdimensional realities. There we go. Now, these other hyperdimensional realities are not trying to unify physics and see what happens. These are hyperdimensional realities which are aimed at explaining paranormal phenomena and or consciousness. So their approach is different. There's Zollner's 4-dimensional space, 1877, which was discredited. Rauscher's 8-dimensional theory, 1977, up through the Russell and Targ paper and everything. Puthoff, Targ, and May were developing in 1979 an 8-dimensional theory, which is related to Rauscher's theory. I believe I read that she helped them with that theory, so there's some input there and crossover. Rauscher and Targ, 8-dimensional theory, 2003, and she was passing out papers for that after her talk here. William Tiller is developing an 8-dimensional theory, basically 2 4-dimensional spaces, one electrically induced, ours is electrically induced, the other 4-dimensional space is magnetically induced. And Robert Jahn is working on something called the M5 theory, which he sort of hedges when he is asked whether that's a true 5-dimensional theory or not. And then there's my 5-dimensional theory, and I call it SOFT, S-O-F-T, standing for single operational field theory. And this is the extension. Einstein wanted a single field. All field phenomenon, everything We're just different aspects of a single field. So rather than calling, as he did, a unified field theory, I call it single field theory or soft. And there's a little joke in the soft thing, because I do soft physics. Everyone else does hard physics. Soft is the only theory that I know of to explain both consciousness and the paranormal as logically natural, emergent consequences of the structure of our five-dimensional physical reality. Now, all these various theories that I've talked about are just one theory. They're just one theory. And just scientists looking at it a different way. Now, many present research efforts are either progressing or evolving toward the single five-dimensional model. Superstring theories are evolving into brains, membranes. They call them brains, but I think the people, no, jokingly, I think the people doing them don't have brains. Thank you, Elizabeth. Okay, now they have the 10-dimensional brains, 11-dimensional, or the superstring theories, 10, 11-dimensional. They're breaking down into combinations of membranes. You can have two 4-dimensional brains connected by a 2-dimensional brain, and then that gives you the 10-dimensional superstring theory. Or you can have two 4-dimensional brains embedded in a 5-dimensional bulk. No mention of what the 5-dimensional bulk is. It's a significant something else. Then you can have two 5-dimensional brains embedded in a 6-dimensional bulk, and that gives you the 11-dimensional supergravity model. Or you can have a single 4-dimensional brain extended in a 5-dimensional bulk, which is essentially my theory, Clifford's theory, and the Einstein-Kluse theory. The 8-dimensional models, I'm going to show how Elizabeth Rauscher is talking about the same thing I am, but she's putting it 8-dimensionally, I'm saying it 5-dimensionally. The various 8-dimensional models are just double 4-dimensional models embedded in 5-dimensional space. And the 10D models are just double 5D models. Everything seems to be, as a historian, I see everything is progressing towards a single 5-dimensional model. The advantage is, once they get to the single 5-dimensional model, they can adopt about 100 years of geometrical work, including the Einstein 5-dimensional theory, which is what I'm trying to do. It'll be a lot richer that way. Now, the 8-dimensional models can, or 8-dimensional geometries can reduce to a 5-dimensional geometry. You've got our space-time right here. The 3-dimensional space, the 5th dimension, then into the board along this axis is time. To have a point in our normal 4-dimensional space-time, you'd have x sub 1, y sub 1, z sub 1, t sub 1. On this line, this would be called an A line in the Kluse theory. You'd have 5 coordinates, I, x, y, z, and t. Now, in the double 4-dimensional models, you have another plane out here, another 4-dimensional plane. So you have ix, iy, iz, it. Well, if you're talking about a point off of the perpendicular line in another 4-dimensional space, which would be represented by another plane out here in that point, then you've got x, y, z, t, ix, iy, iz, it to define a connection between them. So an extended 5-dimensional space is the same thing as two 4-dimensional brains. Now, brain theory is quite popular. Brain theory posits either 3-dimensional brain, which is our common space, extended inside a 4-dimensional bulk space, and that's the same as Clifford's 1870 model. So the superstring theory are just doing 150-year-old physics. Several theories of the brain suggest either a brain of width up to 1 millimeter, up to infinity, or even a shadow parallel brain within the bulk. And this was all mentioned just about 3 or 4 months ago in a popular science article on 10-dimensional universes. You can't read it very well here. This is a quote from, over here we have a quote from Stephen Hawking in his 2001 book, The Universe in a Nutshell. And he's talking about the brain theories. He's not a brain theorist, he's not a superstring theorist, but he's interested in talking about them. He says matter and non-gravitational forces like the electric force would be confined to the brain, our four-dimensional brain. Thus, everything not involving gravity would behave as it would in 4 dimensions. In particular, the electric force between the nucleus of an atom and the electrons orbiting around it would fall off with distance to the right rate for atoms to be stable. So he says the brain theory works. But you have a parallel shadow brain, and only gravitons can go between the two 4-dimensional brains. And he suggests that that shadow brain is where our consciousness is. But his 2 4-dimensional brain models, his shadow brain, 2 4-dimensional brains, is similar to the 8-dimensional theories of Rauscher, Tiller, and others, because you have 2 4-dimensional brains that are equal to an 8-dimensional universe. Again, all the different theories are coming together. Now you have my theory, soft, versus the brain theory. And characteristics of my theory softer over here and brain theory here. I say our universe is four-dimensional sheet curved in five-dimensional. That's due to Clifford in 1870 and Einstein and Bergman, 1938. Well, they say a 3D or 4D brain is curved in a 4D or 5D bulk. They're saying the same thing. I say all matter and normal physical phenomena occur within this four-dimensional sheet. They say matter and non-gravitational forces like the electric force would be confined to the brain. That's the quote by Hawking I just read. Saying the same thing. I call it a sheet. They call it a brain. Consciousness, life, and mind are five-dimensional physical quantities. That's what soft theory says. They say there's some speculation the shadow brain could contain our consciousness. Again, that was Hawking said that. And I say we're a four-dimensional, we're a five-dimensional world, and our four-dimensional sheet is just a slice, a very dense portion of the five-dimensional field. Whereas they say it's a bulk. Well, a bulk implies it has some physical properties, but they haven't defined that yet. So basically, my single field is the brain theory people's bulk. Do you see the similarities between the theories? They're sort of evolving towards my point of view. Now, the proliferation of all these hyperdimensional theories is similar to a number of blind men trying to describe the same elephant by touching different parts of the elephant's body, but there's still just one elephant. And one elephant is a five-dimensional single field. We're all trying to see it. Elizabeth and others, Bill Tiller using eight-dimensional theories, superstring theory. We're all talking about the same thing, feeling around. All these hyperdimensional theories, including Bohm's theory, can be unified into a single five-dimensional model. That was Einstein's dream, the single field theory. And that's what we're slowly fulfilling. Now, depending on different perspectives from a five-dimensional physical reality, the biofield is either a product of, an extension of, or a specific structural configuration within the five-dimensional single field. As such, the biofield can be easily described by an Einstein-inclusive five-dimensional model of the space-time continuum. And that's what I'm trying to do. Now, given that hypothesis, where do we start to build up our structure of the universe? We start from a simple hypothesis of a real fifth dimension filled by the single field. But this is where Einstein and Bergman didn't do. I say there's one property of the field, and that's that it can vary in density. So our four-dimensional sheet is actually a very dense portion of the five-dimensional field. Einstein refused to give this single field any properties, and therefore gave up the search. It went to other fields. Then we asked, what physical form or structure does this fifth dimension take? Now, I just did that one. Okay, there's simple rules for sheet building. These would be mathematical or physical rules. Now, the point-by-point extension from four-dimensional space, five-dimensional space must be extremely small to guarantee that we do not normally sense our fifth dimension. That's why Einstein gave up the search for a five-dimensional single field. We can't sense it, it can't be detected, but his mathematics said it is macroscopically extended. So therefore he gave it up. He could not bring those 2 points of view. And I call that the Einstein paradox. We can rule out both infinitesimally small thicknesses of the sheet, that includes the Planck length, as well as infinite extensions of the sheet in the fifth direction, because they give mathematical physical anomalies. The fifth direction is macroscopically extended instead of infinitesimally extended, as in the Kaluza model used by superstring theorists, but similar otherwise to the brain theory. So they're saying basically that our four-dimensional space-time is a sheet like this, and not saying anything about the bulk, but it's separate from the bulk. I'm just saying the sheet is continuous with the bulk. So this would be your four-dimensional space-time is in the sheet, but it's continuous. It's the same material, that same single field. And so I'm just saying it's extended macroscopically, where they're saying the sheet is a Planck length thick. Our four-dimensional continuum is just a very thin sheet which cuts across the fifth dimension. So we are actually just part of this five-dimensional space. We think it's an extension of us, of our four-dimensional universe, but actually we're just a part of it, depending on whether you're doing four-dimensional, looking at five dimensions, five-dimensional, looking back on four dimensions. That's the perspective that I talked about a few minutes ago. Now, the sheet is continuous in the fifth direction, since it will only be a denser part of the single five-dimensional field, out of which all true physical fields evolve, but it is not separate from. Again, the brain theory is separate from the bulk. I'm saying it's continuous with the field. So the sheet has an effective width, not a true width, because it doesn't have any boundaries. It's just an effective width of about the diameter of proton times the fine structure constant. This is not a true width. Under these circumstances, Clus's original restrictions on his electromagnetic five-dimensional theory still hold, and they are that all points in four-dimensional space are extended to an equal length in 5 dimensions, and they form closed loops. So a point in our four-dimensional space-time would form a closed loop, and all the loops are of equal length. And that builds a whole mathematical system. Now with this, I can say the fifth dimension has a structure of a single polar Riemannian sphere, and this explains concepts of torsion and particle spin, because particles exist within the sheet, and then I can say since it's single polar, this would give you the half spin for proton, electron, and other particles, which has been a big problem in this type of theory before. So elementary particles are folds in the sheet, just simple folds in a sheet. So there the sheet is folded, and that would be a proton. So this is a picture of proton. Here we have three-dimensional space-time, extension of fifth dimension, then time is in 2. So where you have a fold and a doubling over like this, that would be a proton. And then a light wave, or a photon, would just be a single line element like this. And I just gotten rid of the wave-particle duality. The particle part of electromagnetic is the part that cuts across here, and the rest of this is the wave part. There is no such thing as wave-particle duality. Now, normal human perception. So, for all intents and purposes, all matter is stuck within the sheet. We are stuck within the sheet. All of our 5 senses are stuck within the sheet. What we normally sense as electric, magnetic, and gravitational fields are stuck within the sheet. The gravity, electric, and magnetic fields that we normally perceive are just different manifestations or structures of the 5-dimensional single field within the sheet. Our normal 5 senses are totally within the sheet. So as far as we normally know, our total experience of the world and universe is inside the sheet and thus independent of the 5th dimension. That's our normal 5 senses. Now, the sheet in common physics. The effective width of the sheet determines the quantum of action upon which all quantum theories are based. So quantum theory only exists within the sheet. Otherwise, all particles follow physical restrictions noted in the special theory of relativity. I'm giving a whole new importance to special theory of relativity. I've just unified quantum theory and special relativity, which no one has really done yet. So when particles move at some relative speed relative to other particles in the sheet, they undergo a Lorentz-Fitzgerald contraction. So we have a particle like this sticking up in the 5th dimension. As it moves relative to the rest of the sheet, it squeezes. But the volume, 5-dimensional volume, must remain constant. So as the particle moves, speeds up, it actually pushes further up into the 5th dimension. As it slows down, loses energy, it goes down to its rest mass height. And I call that the aspect. So when this squeezes particles' 5-dimensional effective volume, forcing the interior of the particle up further along the 5th dimension, increasing the particle's 5-dimensional aspect as a function of its kinetic energy. Now, with that that's special relativity, how it works with the sheet and particles. Now I go on to chemistry. I'm explaining what life is. Normal chemical reactions occur within the sheet. In physics, chemical reactions are represented as energy exchanges between particles and molecules. So when they exchange energy, what you have is a lot of particles from the 5-dimensional aspect, a high-energy particle, low-energy particle, then they exchange energy, so they go like this, and they change their aspect in the 5th dimension. These are actually field density variations in the 5th dimension. These field density changes are felt by other particles and objects via the 5-dimensional connections, because we're all just part of that single 5-dimensional. So if something happens in one part of the field, it can be felt, a subtle energy, in another part of the field. This is normally called quantum entanglement. So quantum entanglement occurs outside the sheet in the 5th dimension, whereas quantum physics occurs inside the sheet. That's why quantum theorists can't explain what entanglement is. And they can't explain what entanglement is, although they use the term all the time. The single continuous field in the 5th dimension is both a medium of quantum entanglement and quantum entanglement itself. The quantum occurs within the sheet, entanglement outside the sheet. Now I'm going to try and explain a normal chemical reaction. What we're doing is we're looking at just the edge of the paper like this, the spatial dimension. Fifth dimension is up, time is in. So this is the edge of the sheet. The small lines are hydrogen, H2. This is a gas mixture. The tall ones are O2. So this is an oxygen gas mixture. What happens when you put a match to it, or an electric spark? Bam, you've got H2O. Okay, these are leftover hydrogen molecules, oxygen, and these are the oxygen. That is a simple chemical reaction. So if you'd see that over time in the sheet, it would be a wave in the sheet along the timeline. Now that is a single reaction. What about an equilibrium reaction? An equilibrium reaction, you go either way. So we get an equilibrium reaction, it would go one way, then the other way. So an equilibrium chemical reaction would be like a wave, a pattern along the timeline in the sheet. Let me see. See the pattern evolving from the tops of those points? That would be the wave pattern. So that's an equilibrium reaction where you can go forwards or backwards. Now, visual analogy. An equilibrium reaction forms a recognizable, reciprocating, ordered pattern of aspect change along the timeline of the reaction, just as I said. This will look like an irregular wave or wrinkle along the timeline, one axis, in a tablecloth or sheet. So I'm analogizing this. Our four-dimensional space-time is just a sheet, a cloth, or this piece of paper. I'll use paper analogy since I have paper up here. In other words, the pattern of field density variations is imprinted within the single field occupying five-dimensional space by the equilibrium reactions. As those aspects go up and down, they're leaving like a little trail of the wave pattern in the single field, and that's a field density pattern. However, it would be possible for different equilibrium reactions to come together to form a common connected quantum entangled interaction. So you got a bunch of different equilibrium reactions together. Their energies are feeding each other. So they're like surviving together, feeding off of each other's energies and interactions. Now, what do we call that? Anybody? Would that not be a living organism? That's exactly what a living organism is. So what is life? Life at last. We have life. Life, each reaction supplements, complements the other reactions, such that each reaction feeds and or contributes to the remaining common chemical mixture, yielding a mutual, self-sustaining chemical complexion or reaction state. It is a very complicated field density pattern in 5D space in the single field. The resulting density variations are imprinted in the five-dimensional single field to form a single complex pattern. Complex, complexity, chaos theory, I believe this can be modeled using chaos and complexities. Basically, the equation would be called an attractor. This single complex pattern could theoretically be modeled as an attractor equation. I'd love to do that. Someone will give me the money for research, I'll go do it. Pick out a nice team, do it. I don't have the money for research, so I can't do it. In this case, I don't really know chaos theory. That's mathematics. And I teach a little small school away from other schools, so I can't even get anybody to teach me chaos theory. I have to do what I do on my own. And as I tell my students, I learned mathematics in the year 10 BC. 10 years before calculators. So I can't get to chaos theory, so I have to have other people working with me. I haven't found anybody yet to work with me and do this. If it happens, though, I plan on patenting life itself, because you can patent an equation. So I will patent that equation. I will own life. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to own all the drug companies and give everybody cheap drugs. The kind to help you medically. Because they'd use the formula like crazy. In this case, the cloth or bed sheet, my analogy, or the piece of paper would have a complicated repeating pattern of changing wrinkles and ripples across surface. So if this is space-time here, there'd be a complicated pattern on it. So you have a complicated pattern of ripples, and that is what life is. Now, basic chemistry life. Life, the something extra, occurs when a specific mixture of different chemical reactions evolves into an organism by forming a superentanglement of different equilibrium reactions, just changing the words a little bit. This superentanglement corresponds to a mathematical complexity that represents a self-sustaining single-field density pattern in 5D, or life evolves, it emerges from the four-dimensional chaos of interacting atoms and molecules as a five-dimensional complexity. Life then acts as an organizational principle for the entangled chemical reactions. So once life evolves, it starts organizing. This is evolution theory. I'm trying to explain what evolution is for a physicist, from which it emerges. Now, life further organizes, controls the organism's internal chemical reactions to improve the normal functioning of the body and enhances further evolution, forming a two-way dependence of the material body, chemical reactions on life, and then life organizes. So life is a physical, five-dimensional, but non-material. By non-material, I mean four-dimensional, because matter is stuck in the sheet, four-dimensional sheet, quantity which can be called the biofield. So that's your biofield. Now we're going to go from that because evolution continues. Over time, the living organism comes into contact with a greater portion of the environment and undergoes a greater variety of interactions. It grows. It might absorb chemical reactions which fit its pattern or its attractor, or it reacts to heat, cold, different environmental conditions, and with life organizing in it, it evolves further. New internal chemical reactions become necessary for ordinary survival within the context of the changing external environment, but only those chemical reactions that are compatible with or help sustain or enhance the function of the complexity are compatible with and do not disrupt the attractor equation survive. This is how I would mathematize this model of life. As the number and variety of organism environmental interactions increases, the internal structure of the organism becomes increasingly more complicated in both form and function. The organism can even absorb new chemical reactions. Eventually, it becomes so complicated with these new organs that it has to develop another new organ to control the others, a material organ. That is the brain. It develops the brain to control and work with and just make sure everything works okay. And that is the brain. But this is a material brain, an electromechanical device, four-dimensional device. Then this specialized control is the brain. The brain has strictly a four-dimensional existence. Then we have evolution mind. Coinciding with the emergence of the brain, an even more complex pattern of field density variations is imprinted on the life pattern. The secondary complexity is mind. So mind is another complexity, five-dimensional single field density variation pattern, but much finer than the life pattern. So it's a pattern within a pattern. So if the sheet is our four-dimensional space-time, and all the wrinkles and everything in the sheet are the life pattern, then you put print over top of the life pattern, and the print is your mind. Purely five-dimensional, the mind is purely five-dimensional, and the only contact with the material body is through the life pattern. In the cloth analogy, which I just gave, again, the printing would be mind, whereas the wrinkles and ripples of life would be in the sheet itself. I say with cloth, I'd say that the weave is, instead of the printing, I say that the weave in the cloth is your mind, whereas the cloth itself, the ripples and wrinkles in it, like on a sheet on your bed, would be the life pattern. The weave would not be uniform but irregular with stretched areas and gaps as it forms to the wrinkles and ripples corresponding to the life or the biofield in the cloth. Then from life to mind. Mind then acts as the overall organizing principle for life and the material body, as well as acting through the reacting electrochemically through the brain, four-dimensional brain. The brain continues to evolve under the organizational principles of the mind. Now the mind is controlling life, which is controlling the material body chemical reactions and such. As further contexts of physical environment continue. The brain collects sensations and data, which the mind stores magnetically in a single field. So you've got, now within mind in a single field density pattern, you have memories being stored in mind and inside that pattern. So the mind pattern is becoming more and more complex as more memories are stored there. These are specific patterns as it encounters a still wider variety of physical phenomena in its local four-dimensional environment. The five normal senses work wholly within the four-dimensional space-time environment to input data through the body to the brain, thus affecting further evolution of the mind. The collection of memories allows the mind to learn that physical objects outside of the local range of its five senses continue to exist. So, with those memories, the mind starts to differentiate between local space and non-local space, physics talk. Non-local space, I know that Beverly's over there talking, even though she's outside my normal senses, outside my mind. She's over there talking. I know the Australians are still on the other side of the world. That's non-local. So the mind differentiates from the memories stored between locality and non-locality. Again, that's physics talk. The mind begins to cognize or become aware of the non-local nature of its external spatial environment. In the final phase of evolution, as experienced so far, the mind begins to comprehend, or rather becomes aware of, the flow of time itself. Those memories, more build up in the mind, those patterns in the mind, magnetic patterns in the mind, learns there is a past, the present, which it is inhabiting, and a future. So the mind then learns of the flow of time, or the difference between local time and non-local time, outside its immediate environment. So now the mind begins to differentiate between local space-time and non-local space-time. In other words, the mind becomes aware of its self, self being local, the rest of the universe being non-local. And what is an awareness of self? That's the common definition of consciousness. With this, consciousness evolves as a new, even finer complexity pattern. So we have our sheet, or piece of paper. The printing on the sheet, the ripples in the sheet are life. The printing on the paper is mind. But if you look very closely at the printing on the paper, it's a lot of little black dots, and those little black dots are consciousness. A finer complexity yet. Okay, consciousness corresponds to living organisms develop a knowledge of its unique place within a greater universe which has a history as well as a future. The organism distinguishes between itself and the rest of the universe at large. Consciousness evolves. I already did that. I'm trying to speed up a little bit for time. Psi phenomena, paranormal phenomena. Consciousness organizes memories in the mind according to its new awareness of space and time with respect to the rest of the universe. But now, consciousness and mind are out in the fifth dimension. So their universe is five-dimensional, extra-normal, hyperdimensional, extrasensory. It organizes controlled mind and life directly as well as material body through the intervention of brain. Being a completely five-dimensional entity whose connection to four-dimensional space-time is mediated by mind, consciousness has the ability to directly sense its five-dimensional environment and the totality of the universe. Buddha called it compassion. Without the mediation of the four-dimensional brain. So the consciousness is taking in data from the rest of the universe, shoving it down to mind where it's stored as a memory. Exactly opposite to our four-dimensional universe where sensory input comes through senses, brain, into mind, where they're stored as memories. Same thing, just a reversal. This new sense amounts to intuition and psi. Consciousness is a physical quantity, but is not material. It's still physical, single field, but it's not material because matter is in four-dimensional space-time. While mind and consciousness act on the four-dimensional environment through the brain and thus the body, they correspond to and envelop the whole organism. So mind, consciousness are the whole organism, not the brain. That's where the rest of science is screwing up. They're trying to locate it in the brain. It's not there. The brain is like a radio transmitter receiver. And I can prove that all the way down to the model of the neuron, which I won't have time to do. And I have done that at the science consciousness conferences out in Tucson. I'm in competition with the Penrose-Hameroff model of consciousness. Hameroff doesn't like me. Consciousness has emerged naturally and logically from the physics of five-dimensional space-time continuum as a further refinement within the Biofield. Consciousness now hardwires the brain for future generations in its organizational capacity. That comes out DNA. It hardwires the brain, and then consciousness from there on is more or less imprinted on future generations. So they don't have to go through this evolution again. It's already there materially. They only have to build through their own memory systems the five-dimensional connections. Now, here's a quick model, the human model. In this model, there are four tiers or levels corresponding to the stages of evolutionary development. Chemical reactions evolve life. Life organizes chemical reactions. Life evolves mind, organizes life, organizes chemical reactions. Mind evolves consciousness, which then organizes mind, which organizes life, which organizes chemical reactions. And this is the structure. This is an amplified biofield structure. Each level reinforces and stabilizes its neighbor above and below in the hierarchy, or in other words, or in words that have more meaning in physics, each level is entangled with other levels, adding structural stability and coherence to the whole physical model. I've explained psi. Psi is basically 5-dimensional, hyperdimensional, extra-dimensional, extrasensory. It's all the same thing. Extrasensory is extra-dimensional, skip that. So I've got this little homunculus here. This is a living person. This is a space-time diagram. Again, this is 3 space. Up and down is the 5th dimension. Then into the board is time. So here's a body, and the body is going to seem like a little lump like this. A little lump like that, little space-time curvature, very small. It has one pattern. That pattern is life. Now, these are over and printed, but I couldn't draw that. It's got a finer pattern, which is mind, here. It's got a finer pattern, which is consciousness, here. Now, these are stuck. These are all density patterns in the 5th dimension, so any changes happen over here are picked up by consciousness back to mind. If you want to have PK is just the interaction of consciousness across the 5th dimension to some matter here in a 4-dimensional sheet. If you want to have telepathy, it's just this consciousness reacting with the next consciousness over there. Because as field density patterns change there, then they affect the single field. And those effects are felt by consciousness. Okay. So what happens when we die? This is, my little homunculus is now dead. Notice the crosses in his eyes. This is a dead homunculus. Still has space-time curvature, still has matter. But what's dissolved? The life pattern it's gone. It's been disrupted, been decohered. But what still exists? Mutually enforcing each other. Mind still exists. See, life actually protects mind from the dying process. The chemical reactions are disrupted. That disrupts life. But mind and consciousness, mind evolves consciousness. Consciousness organizes mind. They're still coherent. But they're in the 5th dimension. Now, you can call it spirit, soul, whatever you want to. I don't care. I call it a mind-consciousness complex because I want to stay within the limits of science. That's what happens to us when we die. The mind-consciousness continues. Now, I can go on for another 3-4 hours. I can explain all the characteristics of near-death experiences and everything else. I can explain what the light is. I can explain what the tunnel is. I can explain what hell is, all on this model. In fact, I just gave that talk at another conference about 3 weeks ago. So I should be about out of time, so I'll leave it with that and a lot of curiosity in your minds, I assume. Thank you.